Hello everyone! Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to Let's Have Renaissance, a podcast about writing, editing, publishing, the arts, and more. I am Ito Utini.
And I'm Makaya Utini, and today we're speaking with Stanley Ridgley. Stanley is an author, educator, and former military intelligence officer. He served 5 years in West Berlin, where he received the George S. Patton Award in Leadership from the 7th Army Academy in Bad Tölz, West Germany. He also holds a doctorate and a master's in international relations from Duke University and an international MBA from Temple University, and he studied at Moscow State University and the Institut de Gestion Sociale in Paris. He's currently working on his fourth book and teaching management at Drexel University in Philadelphia. We're excited to have him on today. Before we begin, I've got a quick announcement for our listeners. We're curating resources for artists and writers on our blog. It's completely free. Check it out at thedatekeepers.com and feel free to reach out anytime and let us know what other resources you want us to build. Also, we'd really appreciate if you'd subscribe, like, comment, and share this podcast with your friends and on your socials so we can reach more people and do more for the creative community. Thank you.
Stanley, thank you for joining us today. Please tell us about you and your work and your journey.
Well, my journey is so varied that some people might call me a dilettante, but I can give you a little flavor of this. I was a young man in the military studying Russian and became a Russian-American linguist in military intelligence. I later became a military intelligence officer. I did all of this, of course, after graduating from UNC Chapel Hill. I later left the military, went back to school to get my PhD at Duke University in international relations and also focusing on the politics of the Soviet Union. Worked in nonprofit sector for a while. I visited first the Soviet Union and then Russia about 20 times. And then I began teaching at Temple University, International Business. I got my MBA in International Business at Temple University, and I switched over to Drexel University, was recruited away about 15 years ago, and I've been teaching in the business school for about 15 years. And I really enjoy teaching in business as utilizing tools of analysis, utilizing the idea of gathering information systematically, processing that and analyzing that, and then yielding insights that can help us create wealth for the betterment of our fellow human beings.
We want to get into talking about your books, but before we do, can you give us a little background and tell us about your experiences living and working abroad?
Well, yes, that journey began when I was a young person, growing up in a military family. I lived in Panama for a number of years, and then it continued when I joined the military, and I served 2 tours in what was then West Germany, and part of that was in West Berlin, in the divided city, which was located in the heart of East Germany. Learned quite a bit working in military intelligence behind the Iron Curtain. And since that time, I've taught in many countries. I got my MBA at Temple University, international MBA. I lived in Russia for a short period of time, and also in Paris studying at the American Business School. I've taught in a variety of countries. I've taught both business and basically business communication in communist China for 4 years, off and on, not living there, but basically traveling and teaching intensive courses in the Sun Yat-sen School of Business, Sun Yat-sen University, also in Colombia, and in Singapore, and certainly in Russia. And it's been an incredibly enlightening journey, I think. I've taught 10 years intensive business course at Wellinkar Institute for Finance in Mumbai, India. So, yes, all of that experience tends to leaven my perspective on business and levels my perspective on how we deal with each other the idea being, of course, that we want to benefit each other through fruitful exchange, the creation of wealth, and then exchanging that wealth. And by doing so, we make everyone's lives a bit better.
Now, to what degree was your life path the result of conscious planning, and to what degree was it the result of circumstances or other people's decisions or factors that were beyond your control?
Well, you never really are able to predict where you're going to go. If you want, maybe you can if you live in, say, the same place for your entire life, as did Immanuel Kant, for instance. But you never really can predict where you're going to end up. And I never thought that I would end up in the city of Philadelphia for about 32 years, teaching at Temple University and at Drexel University. And I now live in Jacksonville, Florida, and I basically commute to teach at Drexel University in Philadelphia. So the decisions that you make, basically it's kind of like path dependence, that the options you have available to yourself today are a result of the decisions that you made in the past, 2, 3, 5, 10 steps earlier. And so the decision to go into the military, the decision to, rather than become, a Green Beret, which was one of my ambitions, to instead go into military intelligence and then serve behind the Iron Curtain, listening to the Soviet, what we called the Glavny Vrag, which was the main enemy at the time. And then you learn, in my case, you learn Russian, you become conversant in it, and then you go back to graduate school, and of course that's your graduate school language, and then you study, as I did, international relations with a focus on the Soviet Union. And you learn an awful lot about ideology, the ideology of totalitarianism, the ideology of socialism and communism. And you learn about, in very fine-grained manner, in a very granular sort of way, the ins and outs of an ideology and how an ideology can present itself as being quite attractive to people who basically live life on the surface, live life in a very superficial manner, and are convinced by the nostrums of a particular ideology, only to find themselves stuck in it after a period of time. I learned an awful lot from our East European brothers and sisters. I've learned quite a lot in the subsequent period of time, in the academy, that the folks in the academy who have lived in the former Soviet Union, who have lived in the former East European communist countries, have a very keen appreciation of the direction of American politics. And I would say that my interactions with both these persons who are rigorously trained, rigorously educated, as well as my colleagues in my current position, especially my Israeli colleagues who are former members of the Israeli Defense Forces, like the IDF. I've learned quite a bit about ideology, how it can mold men's and women's minds, and the deleterious consequences that can arise from that.
Can you share some concrete examples of things you witnessed on the ground living abroad in countries that have different historical relationships to socialism or communism or other political ideologies than we've had here in the industrialized West, and things that Americans and others in the West might not have seen?
Well, certainly I lived in West Berlin for a year and a half, and of course East Berlin, under the communist rule, East German communist rule, was the showpiece for the communist world. And I had ample opportunity to visit East Berlin going through the checkpoint Charlie in West Berlin, and got to witness much of the economic immiseration of the East Bloc. And this was even in the showcase or showpiece of the communist world. East Berlin was indeed selected by the Soviet Union to be the showcase of what the socialist communist countries could do. At the time, it was the East Bloc, the Warsaw Pact countries. And it was so enlightening, and certainly in the fact that the Soviet Union used to call Poland under communist rule and East Germany under communist rule, used to call them the West, you folks in the West. And the lives of Poles and, to use an example, and East Germans were immeasurably better than what you could find in the Soviet Union. And yet we would find it appalling, the degree of backwardness, the inability to produce the most basic necessities of life, the idea of stores that were always in short supply of some of the necessities, of course, being toilet paper, toothpaste, and that sort of thing. Shoes that would fit, shoes that wouldn't fall apart. The idea of quality control, or the idea that the customer is always right, or the idea that consumers are king, is completely alien to a socialistic society. What's important is meeting quotas, is getting the stores full of stuff, irrespective of whether that stuff is of high quality or not. So I bought a lot of stuff in East Berlin that I could then bring back and say, here is the product of a socialist society. It did the same when I went to the Soviet Union. I visited the Soviet Union in 1988 when it was still the Soviet Union, which of course fell in 1991. But when it was still the Soviet Union, it was an incredibly it was an incredible wasteland in terms of consumer products. And what was available was of incredibly poor quality and really not worth buying. I also purchased a whole collection of poor Soviet goods. I also actually, when I visited Leningrad, which is now St. Petersburg, I befriended a couple of black marketeers, and I spent a day on the Soviet black market pretending to be a black marketeer. At the time, I had a beard, I could speak Russian, and so I would pass as Russian quite easily. And so Vladimir Ivanov was the guy's name, and his friend Arsen, who refused to tell me his last name, quite understandably so. I walked around with them selling goods or trying to sell goods to American tourists. And I learned from personal experience, the nature of a black market or a gray economy, or anything in a controlled economy that's worth anything is going to find its way out the back door of a store into the black market, where it can then be bought and sold according to its actual value. Because in a socialistic economy, prices are controlled, causing incredible shortages of things, because people tend to buy them up, hoard them if they're good, the stuff that's not sent out the back door. So those are some of the personal experiences that I had with communistic socialistic societies. I actually saw a bread line, and I stood in a bread line in the Soviet Union, and I did this very presciently. I wanted to be able to say that yes, I stood in a Soviet bread line and waiting for bread. I never got the bread, but indeed I did experience the kind of quasi-poverty that really affected Soviet citizens, Russian citizens, throughout the tenure of the Soviet Union.
And while you were there studying and learning Russian and conducting your life in Russian, did you get much chance to engage with Russian literature?
Engage with Russian literature. Well, I have an incredibly large Russian library, of course, in Cyrillic. And I will tell you, there's nothing really more difficult that I found than reading Russian literature. And I'll tell you what, the brothers Karamazov, War and Peace, that sort of thing, it's entire pages, several pages of tiny Russian script, Cyrillic, all in one paragraph that lasts for several pages. And that, combined with the fact that you are really reading a text that was written well over 100 years ago, and a lot of the vocabulary of, say, rural Russian life is simply alien to me. Now, of course, when you learn Russian, and your job is to know Russians and military terminology or business terminology, you tend to focus your vocabulary in those areas. So, say, farm implements off of the Russian, Russian rural area, you simply don't know what you're talking about or doing with. So the answer to your question is yes, I was exposed. I certainly works of Chekhov and the Две надежды тихой славы, недолго не жил нас обман, исчезли юные забавы, как сон, как утренний туман. So, it's very melodious when you're talking about Russian pronunciation, the Russian language, but it can be very gruff, it can be very unforgiving. And so you have to have a special disposition and understanding. It sounds like, I like to say in the vernacular, it's like German, it sounds like a bad guy language.
Well, I was just asking because I was wondering if you have a favorite piece of Russian literature or a favorite author, because you were talking about the things that you witnessed, and a lot of those, the dramas and the fallout from the rise of communism in Russia, you see it anticipated, especially in the works of Dostoevsky and also to some degree in the works of Chekhov, and that makes that body of literature fascinating as sort of a premonitory vision that these writers were having. And I'm curious if you also engaged in their work and were intrigued by it for the same reason.
Well, first of all, let me just interject here. One of the ways that I maintained my my Russian language was I would read Sidney Sheldon novels, which are not the greatest of literature, as you might imagine. They're very superficial, and it's a kind of a fun story to read. But the vocabulary is quite easy. And then I would read the translation of the Sidney Sheldon novel, say Morning, Noon, and Night, in Russian, because Russians love American literature. And so it made it very easy to maintain my facility with Russian by reading a story that was very easy to read and that I already knew. And that it was very easy to parcel out through the context of the word to maintain that kind, especially in present tense, the dialogue in a novel. But as far as deeper Russian literature, Master and Margarita is one.
Oh, yeah.
That is interesting, very interesting. It's a very dark literature, very grim. I've always, you look at most Russian songs, and they're minor key. They're minor key. I was in the Russian folk ensemble when I was in the military in learning Russian in Monterey, California. And we learned Russian songs, and they all seemed to be in minor key. They were not very joyful. Расцветали яблони и кущи, поплыли туманы над рекой. That kind of thing. We did dancing, folk dancing, wore costumes, and we would sing these minor key songs. That's Katyusha. And that was people don't realize Katyusha. Oh, that sounds so marvelous. Well, that was the name of a Russian rocket launcher, multiple rocket launcher used in World War II. And it's a World War II song, but it sounds like ancient folk music. So it's very dark. It's very grim. It's almost like the melodic version of Darkness at Noon by a book by Arthur Kessler. It's not really a Russian book, but it does capture that darkness and minor key mentality that I'm talking about. That's one of my favorite books, the book Darkness at Noon by Arthur Kessler. One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich by Andrei Sakharov. Is Sakharov?
Was that not Solzhenitsyn?
Solzhenitsyn, I'm sorry, he was one of the dissidents. I'm sorry. Sakharov was the nuclear scientist, and Solzhenitsyn, a great author, a giant of the field. And his life,
his only small book, wasn't it?
Yeah, yes. The rest of it is gigantic tomes of the Gulag literature, and that was his specialty. But he was certainly a giant of human freedom, and exemplified that spirit for so many people. I think he was expelled from the Soviet Union in 1974. But yeah, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich is a very powerful book, and you might want to say, in terms of Russian literature, that would be my favorite because of the truth of it, because they exposed so much that was hidden in the Soviet psyche, in the Soviet, certainly physically hidden in the terms of the Gulag, yeah.
Why do you think Russians are so interested in American literature?
I think because they were deprived of it for so long. There was a Russian bookstore in Washington, D.C. called Compton's Bookstore. And it was in existence for many, many years during the Soviet period. And it was run by Soviets. And it was basically trading in, Soviet state-approved literature. I have quite a bit of the Soviet state-approved literature, books that were approved, novels and that sort of thing, exalting the Soviet state and heroism, socialist realism, that kind of thing. But they also sold American literature, but only the literature that would portray the United States in a bad light. The Grapes of Wrath, John Steinbeck was one of them. They had another fascination with an American author of whom I'd never heard, but they loved him. His name is Mine Reid. Are you familiar with Mine Reid?
No, actually.
No.
So there you go. That's what I mean. No one in my Russian class had ever heard of Mine Reid. And so I went in there and I asked them, hey, have you ever heard of Mine Reid? Oh, we love Mine Reid. It's wonderful. And apparently, this little-known American author who was disparaging of American society at the time, it became a favorite. Jack London is another favorite, the socialist Jack London. The only problem with this focus on things like the Grapes of Wrath was that Soviet audiences were so amazed that this person in 1930s, 1940s America owned a car, owned his own automobile. And so this effort to portray the United States, warts and all, and in the depths of a depression, did not really succeed the way the Soviet authorities wanted it to. But I think that there's a rambunctiousness in American freedom, in American literature, that really fascinates the Soviet mind, the Russian mind. So you'll find lots and lots of books, translated into a lot of American classics, especially since the fall of the Soviet Union. You also find books, translations of economics textbooks, American textbooks, college textbooks, translated and that are used in, say, the Moscow State University, where I spent the summer of 2005. Used in classes. Greg Mankew's Basics of Economics is one of the books that I have. It's translated into English. Into Russian, and it's used in Russian classrooms. So that's an interesting sidelight that a lot of people might not realize.
Yeah, and I mean, Russian culture is such a literary culture. I feel like a lot of Russians would probably rather be deprived of food than be deprived of books, and that's got to be a trauma on a national scale to have a whole culture not able to access like much of the world's literature. But speaking of the business books, I was wondering if you could talk to our audience a little bit, because I think a lot of our audience were artists, were writers. Not everyone thinks about art as a business venture. But that doesn't mean we don't need to be compensated for our work. So can you talk a little bit about how we can approach art in a way that is not only artistically sustaining, but also economically viable?
Well, sure. The artistic mind is certainly something that I've struggled with. My own daughter is a graduate of Temple's Tyler School of Art, which is a very prominent, prestigious art school, and she's sculpting and oil and watercolor and pencil sketching, and is quite good. And artists tend to believe that they interpret the world for humankind and that sort of thing. And my kids are all very talented with respect to art. And so I've tried to understand the mind of the artist. My sister-in-law years ago did a pencil sketch of John Lennon. It was so fabulous that she sold it for $500. And she did it from a photograph. And I said, well, the key here, the business lesson here is crank those things out. And no, we can't do that, because that would violate some sort of code of the artist, where you don't want to do the same work twice. And I have no idea what that, I know that your audience would know what she was talking about. But one of the things that I think that is important for anyone, not just business people, but certainly artists who want to make a living off of their artwork, their creations, is to create something valuable for other people. One can pay obeisance to the artistic mind and take you where your heart wants to go, the muse wants to take you in your writing, that sort of thing. But one doesn't need to pay obeisance to some sort of ideal that doesn't really exist in the real world, but instead can say, what can I do to brighten someone's day, to deepen their life, to deepen what they think about, like Van Gogh's Sunflower. You look at Van Gogh's Sunflower, and one of those things, I use this in my classes, one of the most powerful things about it is that it becomes the essence of a sunflower. Whenever someone asks you to think of a sunflower, you tend to think of Van Gogh's painting of a sunflower, not a notional, imaginary sunflower in a field somewhere, but Van Gogh's interpretation and translation of the sunflower to the canvas. And that's something that I think is fascinating about art, and that is something that people really value. And so I think that creating something that other people value is the essence of business. And that's how I would approach it, were I a talented artist, which I am not. But I'm blessed to have been in the company of great artists. My wife is one, and my children are another.
You're also an author yourself. You've written a few books. Can you talk about each one of them and tell us what are they about?
Sure. Years ago in the 90s, I was a budding novelist, and I wrote 2 novels. They were incredibly long, and someone told me, says, what's the book about? And someone else said, well, that's just everything that Stan thinks about in one novel. And shutting off the flow of words is one of the toughest things you can do. I had 3 different agents in New York trying to sell my novels, and I wanted to be a men's action adventure thriller writer. And one of my agents was Pinder Lane and Garenbrook, which was Jay Garen was John Grisham's old agent. So I thought that I would have a shot, but never sold those novels. Switched to nonfiction. And I've written 4, and I'm working on my 5th right now, nonfiction book. My first one might interest your audience because it's called Strategic Thinking Skills, and it is both a 90,000-word series of lectures and a video series that's run by the Great Courses. I'm a Great Courses professor, and some of your audience may have heard of that, but you'll find strategic thinking skills at the Great Courses, and it teaches you how to look forward in an optimistic way and to plan out a strategy for where it is you want to be 5 months from now, 5 years from now, and work toward step by step to reaching those important goals. That's important for everyone, whether you're a plumber or whether you're an artist. And I think that it's very valuable in that sense. And my second book was a business book called Business School Presentations. The complete book teaches you how to give presentations, which is our really artistic performances. And if you begin to think about a business presentation as a performance of communication, I think that you can become a much better business presenter, more successful business presenter than, say, the norm that you find in business, which is usually not very good. I can testify to that. More recently, my book, Brutal Minds, which is basically concerned with, in 2023, with the what is commonly called thought reform on the college campuses, indoctrination, and the idea that yes, people are indoctrinating college students in a certain ideology on the college campuses, but it's not faculty. Sometimes you have faculty, but no, it's really the bureaucracy. And I don't know anyone who likes bureaucracy. I don't even think bureaucrats like bureaucracy. It has a dull sound to it, dull lives, performing dull functions, that kind of thing. Gosh, I'm going to get raked over the coals for saying this sort of thing, but it's the bureaucracy that's indoctrinating students, and I think that we have to imbue our students with the notion of the pursuit of the good, the true, and the beautiful, seeking truth, and utilizing critical thinking skills, and not to accept any kind of ultimate final truth from anyone on a college campus, particularly if it's taught by a clerk or a coordinator or a facilitator. And the ideology I'm referring to is the social justice ideology, which is quite unforgiving and quite Manichaean, binary, good or evil. The final book, well, it's not really the final book. My last book is called DEI Exposed, How the Biggest Con of the Century Almost Toppled Higher Education. And it's a revelatory book for people on both sides of this issue, both of whom, I think, really don't understand what DEI actually is as it is practiced and taught and trained on the college campuses. And that is the revelatory core of this book. And I'm working on another book right now, which is also concerned with higher education. I'm not going to reveal much of anything else of this because it's got a great title, I think. It's something I worked and came up with. And so it's a work in progress. So the creative juices are still flowing with me. I like to think of them as being creative. But I'm certainly happy to answer any questions about any of these books.
Yeah, can you talk about your social justice book?
What you're basically asking me about is the book that I'm working on now, which is really targeted toward social justice and it as a kind of ideology that sounds wonderful to the untutored ear. It offers and promises everything to everyone. Everything's going to be free. Everything will be owned in kind. It's very much the Marxist vision of from each according to his ability to each according to his need, which was basically the first real expression of equity. The term social justice originated back in the 1840s. It was a religious term utilized in Italy, I believe, utilized with respect to in conjunction with prescriptions of scripture and religion. The idea of social justice is really a mask for socialism, because if you look at every definition of social justice, and you'll see many definitions online, they all come back to, and they all prescribe or advocate the, quote, sharing of resources and opportunities in common, ensuring an equitable distribution of chances, opportunities, very much kinds of things that, hey, well, in the abstract, I don't oppose that, but leaving out the portion that it requires confiscation of what people have, and it requires confiscation of what people do. It's basically the enshrinement of envy in a kind of a doctrine. So if you're looking for, it was Thomas Sowell, the famous economist, brilliant man, one of the most brilliant intellectuals of our time, both in the 20th and 21st century, said, envy was once one of the cardinal sins. It's now known by a different name, socialism or social justice. And this is the idea that, it's the idea that you can't see a fat man standing beside a thin man without thinking that the fat man got that way by taking something from the thin man. That's the mindset of people who engage in social justice, who believe in socialism/social justice. And I think that there's a very dark side to the socialism/social justice that is never really touched upon by those who advocate it, and is ignored on the college campuses in terms of a history that you really have to dig out for yourself. In books like The God That Failed, published in 1949 by 6 very famous authors, Arthur Koestler, Stephen Spender, Ignacio Salon, Richard Wright, Andre Gide, who basically were communists and found out what a scam it was and basically rejected communism. You can also look at Darkness at Noon by Koestler. You can look at Friedrich Hayek, the economist who wrote Road to Serfdom, which was a basic rejection of John Maynard Keynes's government-centered idea of the economy. So I think that social justice is like a zombie that you have to keep killing and it keeps coming back. And it's because of this siren song. The most expressive, I think, most recently was by Zoran Mamdani, the newly elected mayor of New York, who said in his victory speech, there is no problem too great that government can't solve, and no problem or concern so minor that government can't take an interest in it. Now that sounds like something out of George Orwell's 1984. It's a perfect expression of the socialist mentality, that a collective body of bureaucrats and paper pushers and clerks, I think it was Zbigniew Brzezinski called it the bureaucracy of clerks, is basically going to dominate our society and take an interest in every perceived problem that anyone has. This is the Soviet Union personified. And so that's my take on a lot of what's been going on with respect to socialism, its new popularity, and its advocacy by Generation Z, which really has very poor historical knowledge, generally speaking, if one is to believe the multitude of TikTok/Instagram videos that we see all the time.
How about DEI Exposed? Can you talk about that one? What challenges did you face when you published it, and how did you deal with them?
Well, I think the biggest challenge is that people have a knee-jerk reaction to the book that is negative. Like, how can you must be racist? You must have some sort of ism here that is a negative ism that is driving you. How could you possibly be against this wonderful program of diversity, equity, and inclusion? Words that were very carefully chosen to mask the actual agenda here. People have both people on both pro and con aspects of DEI have this idealized view of what constitutes DEI, and I think the pro DEI folks tend to think, well, it's just creating a level playing field. It's just giving voice to marginalized voices. It's just teaching about slavery and about racism. Just giving everyone a fair shot. Well, no, it's none of those things. That's not the program of DEI that we find implemented on college campuses. It's simply not. And I document this in my book. And people who oppose DEI tend to think it means elevating unqualified people because of their, say, color of their skin or gender into positions for which they're not qualified. Now, there may be some of that going on, but that's not the primary objection to DEI. There are examples, and they're usually horrific examples, especially with regard to pilots and planes and any other life-saving profession, where if you bend or lower the standards for the candidates for these positions, you're creating a safety hazard. Yeah. Now that may be, that's true, and I think that other people have covered that ground far better than I could. No, the objection to DEI is because it is a racialist doctrine that's a Manichaean, either or, black and white, exploiters and exploited, oppressors and oppressed doctrine that is being taught on the campuses by these DEI facilitators. And I cover this extensively. I quote extensively from what these people say in their trainings. If you want a short form expression that's going to capture the what is so damned bad about DEI's doctrine, is that it's very much the expression of Louis Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam's idea of white devils. The idea that you are basically irreparably racist if you are a white person, and that I can tell the villains and victims around me by the color of their skin, and that alone. Your personal history, your upbringing, your parents, where your country you're from, doesn't matter. Basically, you are racist by virtue of birth, and all you can do is confess and work to get out of this condition of racism, which you will never do, and work against white supremacy culture, which is pervasive in our society. It is mythological. It is pseudoscience. The people who advocate this stuff, they're not really scholars in any generous interpretation of the word. And in fact, what DEI consultants do when they were invited onto the college campuses en masse back in 2020 and 2021, they basically set up a scam, or con game, as I call it in my subtitle. And the con game is called, by psychologists, it's called virtuous victimhood. Virtuous victimhood. This is a resource extraction strategy designed to portray yourself as a victim, to identify your victimizer or villain on the college campus, and then extract resources from the university, or in the case of the corporate America, the business, to pay your reparations, and also to train people to understand that this is the reality of the world, irrespective of what they themselves have experienced. Your lived experience makes no difference. What you have to believe is this ideology that I'm propounding to you, this either or, oppressors and oppressed. And if that sounds familiar, it's because it's come right out of the neo-Marxist playbook. The idea that you're either an oppressor or part of the oppressed, that you're either a colonizer or part of the colonized. It's very easy to identify the villains and victims in this case. You look at the people around you, and you can pick out the villains and victims. It's very primitive. It's basic, and you don't have to be an Einstein to pretend that you're a smart person. Moreover, this primitive ideology is accompanied with this elevating notion that you have been privy to the received truth of this critical theoretical perspective. The idea that you now have critical consciousness, and you can peer into the contradictions within society and understand the relations between power and privilege. There's nothing to substantiate this. There's a whole raft of literature that purports to substantiate it, but which is basically, much of it is just counter-narrative storytelling, made-up composite stories. The body of quote-unquote scholarship that supposedly undergirds this is woefully inadequate to serve any but a propagandistic function. And so that's basically DEI in a nutshell. The book is far more extensive, documented over 650 footnotes, and I let these people speak for themselves, and you understand the scam that they're running. And it's up to you whether you want to be duped by it, taken in by it, or whether you want to say, this is garbage, and I want nothing to do with it.
Earlier, you mentioned that in order for us to believe DEI, we have to ignore our lived experiences. I cannot ignore my lived experiences. I was hopeful that DEI could benefit me. And when I started questioning it was when I found out that DEI was not actually beneficial to me. Instead, it was against me. And I don't really know if other people like me have benefited, but personally, DEI has actually harmed me in some ways. And if it weren't for my hard work, I wouldn't be here. Enough about me. We always ask our guests to read from their work. Can you read from really any of your books, and so that you can share your work with our audience?
Well, sure. I'm going to read a bit from the introduction. What exactly is wrong with diversity, equity, and inclusion? Isn't it noble, moral, right, and proper? Isn't DEI just teaching about slavery, teaching about race, ensuring that everyone gets a fair shot? You know, level playing field and all. It's just plain common sense, isn't it? Isn't it just the right thing to do? Well, those are just some of the platitudes of the con artists working the diversity hustle for profit. And no, it's actually none of those things. These common misrepresentations are just a few among many that are key to making the big con of DEI work. DEI appears as a chameleon, adapting itself to the situation and as the situation demands. It can be whatever is needed at a particular moment in time, with the only criteria, the survival of DEI and its lavishly compensated bureaucracy and the maintenance of its monumental con story. I first heard the actual DEI acronym expressed while I was in a 7-Eleven on the campus during the early days of the COVID pandemic, and it was two masked graduate students discussing the wonderful employment possibilities of this new initiative, which sounded like someone trying to monetize Kumbaya. Already steeped in leftist ideology and its tactic of renaming and relabeling its hooey for new generations of suckers, I was only vaguely aware that this was just the latest brand for the newest social justice foray in higher education. Now, diversity had already been around for many years. It's hustlers scratching at the university door. Not actual diversity, mind you, but the skin-deep diversity of noxious racialism tarted up with fake enlightenment discourse. This concept of diversity, equity, inclusion quickly metastasized until it was everywhere. And this was no accident. It was a bureaucratic initiative designed to anchor a new raft of social justice programs as an inescapable presence on the campus. With special privileges conferred on DEI because of the unfortunate death of George Floyd, this diversity would bypass the faculty. It would, in fact, bypass vetting of any sort. This was the madness of crowds brought en masse onto the campuses, and it was wildly successful. It achieved this success with a superb combination of psychological factors, relentless hustling, a primitive ideology suffused with mysticism and indigenous knowledges, and the barely concealed violent urges of quasi-communist and terroristic revolutionaries. All of this protected from criticism and even the mildest of questioning. And you knew something was terribly wrong with it.
Thank you so much.
No, I just want to say that I hope that your audience enjoyed our show, and that open minds have a look at what's been said, and looking at the broader directions of our society, and look to you as someone who is a supposed beneficiary of this type of enshrined tokenism that ignores your talents and qualities as an individual and subsumes them under your superficial characteristics, and then assuming that you're going to have a particular point of view because of them.
Thank you so much for your kind words. I've been very much looking forward to this.
Yeah, thank you, Stanley.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I do enjoy talking about these issues. I think that they're not talked about enough, and I appreciate the platform. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care.
You too. Have a lovely weekend.
You too.